Welcome, everyone, to I'll Be Home for Christmas, Christmas Ghost Stories 4. This is the fourth year that I've done this. My name is Laura Packer, and I am delighted that you're here with me. This evening, I'm going to share about an hour's worth of stories with you and a little bit of commentary on some of them. Some of these stories are traditional, some of them are out of my own imagination, and some are literary. And I really hope you enjoy this show. Well, we all know A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol, that marvelous novella written by Charles Dickens that tells about the trials and tribulations of Ebenezer Scrooge over the course of one evening, when he is transformed from a remarkably difficult person to, shockingly enough, a good man through the intervention of 3, 4 really interesting ghosts. Now, the tradition of Christmas ghost stories and Christmas creepy stories in general is a very old one. And so during the pandemic, I decided that I wanted to revive the tradition of sharing these stories. So here we go. The first story that I'm going to share with you tonight is another Christmas creepy story by Charles Dickens. He actually wrote quite a few of these leading up to A Christmas Carol, and this one is from the Pickwick Papers. It's called The Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. A long time ago, in an old abbey town, there lived a man called Gabriel Grubb. Now, I know this story is true because the person I learned it from told me it was true, and he learned it from someone who said it was true as well. And so truth must carry through into this moment. And you must take my word for it that Gabriel Grubb lived, and that Gabriel Grubb, well, his name really said it all. Gabriel Grubb was an ill-conditioned, cross-grained, surly fellow. He had no joys in life except for drinking from the old wicker bottle that he always had by his side. All of this may have come from loneliness, but Gabriel Grubb surely would never have admitted such a thing. Well, there we go. Gabriel Grubb worked as a sexton and as a gravedigger, and this job suited him well enough because it was isolated, lonely work, and so he never had to converse with anyone who was living, and the dead, well, they never had much to say. And so it was Christmas Eve that Gabriel Grubb found himself on the way to the churchyard. He had been home alone, conversing with his bottle and with all of the things that fate had dealt him poorly. But it is a lonely thing to be in your home with only a bottle and your disgruntlements for company on Christmas Eve, let alone any other time. So he decided that he would go finish digging the grave that must be dug for the funeral that would be held the next afternoon. He turned up his collar and walked through the icy night. As he walked through the town, holding his lantern, his bottle, and his shovel, he glanced into the windows of the homes he passed, and he saw these homes alight with joy. People laughing, conversing, dancing, playing games, and as he looked at them all, he growled to himself and grumbled that terrible things may be their fate. He saw children running to one house in particular where they all gathered to play games, and he thought of scarlet fever and plague and other ills to comfort himself. As he walked along, foul-tempered and foul-stepped, he saw a boy walking towards him, singing carols out loud with such a sweet voice. The child was surely on his way to join his fellows and play games and sing songs, but Gabriel Grubb saw him and thought only of foul things. He listened to the child singing and hoped that he would be quiet, thinking that such music was disturbing his fragile ears. So when the boy walked by, he walloped him on the backside and the shoulders with his shovel. The boy fell down, the song knocked out of him, and he ran to his friend's house, now crying a very different tune, and Gabriel Grubb was satisfied. That child had stopped singing. The night was silent again. He arrived in the graveyard and set down all of his things, took a swig from his bottle, then jumped down into the hole he had begun to dig earlier in the day and worked. It was terribly hard work. The air had been cold. The ground was frozen. Gabriel Grubb had to fight and claw with his shovel for each ounce of dirt that he removed from the grave, and yet he comforted himself and warmed himself with the thought of that boy's expression when the shovel struck him. Oh, Gabriel Grubb was no good indeed. Well, he worked for about an hour until the grave was nearly dug, and he pulled himself out and sat down on a fallen gravestone to have a sip of something to warm himself and consider all that he had done. He felt most satisfied with himself. He thought again of the way it felt when his shovel struck the boy, and he laughed to himself with delight. And then he heard, and he looked around. Surely, he said out loud, it must be an echo. But then a voice said, deep and gravelly, it was not an echo. And Gabriel Grubb looked around, and there on one of the tombstones, there was sitting a goblin. Surely the most hideous goblin he had ever seen, because to his knowledge he had never seen a goblin before. And the goblin looked at him and smiled, and then stuck out its long tongue at Gabriel Grubb as if it were taunting him. Gabriel Grubb felt fear seep through his body, and anger too. Sir, he said, why are you laughing at me and sticking your tongue out at me? Oh, Gabriel Grubb, said the goblin, I am here tonight because we had to see you. We have heard of you, Gabriel Grubb, and we wondered what man wanders in the graveyard on Christmas Eve. And all around him, surrounding him sides and back and front, Gabriel Grubb heard voices say, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb. And he felt his blood grow cold. What is in the bottle? Said the goblin. Gin, said Gabriel Grubb. Who is it that drinks gin alone in a churchyard on Christmas Eve? And all around him the voices went, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb. And Gabriel Grubb wanted to run, but it was as if his feet were glued to the ground. Then who, said the voice, is our rightful and legal property? And the voices all around him said, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb. Gabriel Grubb was terrified. But then the goblin said to him, well, what do you make of this, Gabriel Grubb? And Gabriel Grubb stood up as straight as he could and said, with his voice shaking, it is all very curious, to be sure, but I would like to finish my work. And the goblin began to laugh and said, I am afraid that my friends want you, Gabriel Grubb. And the voices all around him whispered, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb, Gabriel Grubb. And Gabriel Grubb felt himself be pulled into the earth. Now, I do not know what that feels like, but I can only imagine it is the most terrifying sensation, and so frightening I don't want to think on it long. But I do know that next Gabriel Grubb found himself in a great underground cavern, and there was the Goblin King in front of him, and on all sides all of the goblins he had heard whispering. And the Goblin King said, it is cold tonight, I must have something hot to drink. And into his hand was placed a glass full of fire, and the Goblin King drowned it down. Well, he said, I must not be a bad host. Give one to Gabriel Grubb as well. And a glass was placed into his hand, so hot that it singed his palm. I am not thirsty, he said, but the goblins pinched his nose and tipped the glass so the fire ran down his throat, searing his insides. Very good, said the Goblin King. Now let us see what we shall see. The small goblins all around him parted, so Gabriel Grubb could see one wall of the cave, flat stone, and the stone appeared to shimmer and disappear, as if it were glass falling down to the ground. What do you see, Gabriel Grubb? And Gabriel Grubb watched. He saw a family's living quarters, a mother and more children than he could count, the children swarming around and laughing as their mother tried to prepare their Christmas Eve feast. The children all of a sudden turned and ran to the door, which burst open, and there was the father of the family. They scampered around him like puppies. The family sat down and ate their meal, and Gabriel Grubb watched as the family, though clearly poor by the state of their clothes and the feast that was laid before them, did not seem to regret a single moment of it, but instead celebrated their time together, what they had, and joy filled their hearts. And then the image shimmered and dissolved, and a new image appeared. Christmas a year later, but now the family was not rejoicing and delighted. Instead, they gathered around the bedside of the youngest child, a beautiful boy, who lay there in bed as pale as could be, and who gasped out his last. The parents began to weep. His brothers and sisters held his heavy, cold, still hand to their cheeks. But then he saw in their expressions and their words that though they would miss him terribly, they knew that they would be reunited, and that Christmas was the reminder that all was not lost. And then the scene in front of them shimmered again and reappeared, and he saw the family year after year after year, the children growing up and some growing away, the parents growing old. And he saw a Christmas when both parents were old and frail, but joy was still in their hearts at Christmas as the children came, and the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren, and the families celebrated. And then he saw a year that came when the mother was gone, it was only the father, and though the man missed his wife terribly, he saw the man had the certainty of reunification beyond. And then the scene shimmered again, and the rock returned. The Goblin King leaned forward. Well, Gabriel Grubb, what do you think? It is very pretty, he said, but surely most families are not this happy together. Pah! You are a miserable man, said the Goblin King, and kicked Gabriel Grubb on his rump and his back, and all the small goblins joined in. Well, what do you think of this? Said the king. And the rock shimmered again, and Gabriel Grubb saw a summer scene. A field golden in the sunlight, with trees with heavy green leaves and delicious fruit, and a man and woman walking through the field, full of delight with the day and each other. Well, said the Goblin King, what of that? It is pretty enough. And again the Goblin King said, you are a miserable man, and kicked him, as did all the other goblins. Scene after scene after scene passed before Gabriel Grubb's eyes there on what had been flat rock. And each time the Goblin King asked him, and no answer would satisfy him, and Gabriel Grubb was kicked again and again, until finally a gray mist rose up, and Gabriel Grubb knew no more. He woke in the morning. Fast asleep in the graveyard, he sat up, now wide awake. All around him the world glittered with frost that had settled overnight. He looked about him and saw his bottle empty by his side, his lantern out and dark and cold, his shovel lying upon the ground. And he thought of all that he had seen. He felt in his heart a heaviness lift, And he knew that he was no longer the bitter, angry, lonely man that he had been. He knew that he was no longer the kind of person who would beat a child for singing. He had been reformed. He stood up and thought that he would go into the village, that he would go to church and celebrate Christmas with all of the villagers. And then he thought, what happens when people see that someone claims they are reformed? And he knew he would be mocked, that no one would believe him. And so Gabriel Grubb left that village and was seen no more for a long time. When people came to the churchyard that day, they saw his empty bottle, his lantern, and his shovel, and they thought that surely Gabriel Grubb had wandered off and gotten himself into some kind of trouble. Others said that it must have been the Goblin King who carried him away. But no matter their theories, they could not find a body or the man himself. And soon Gabriel Grubb just disappeared into local lore. Until a decade later, Gabriel Grubb came home. A beard now long down to his chest, his body curved and bent. He walked slowly with a stick because rheumatism filled his bones from where he had been kicked so many times. The people welcomed him and asked him what had happened, and he told them the tale of the Goblin King. They saw a glint in his eye of joy and delight, and knew that no matter what had happened, no matter why he had left the village and been gone for 10 years, that he was truly a changed man. And though he suffered terribly from rheumatism and drank no more, Gabriel Grubb lived out the rest of his days in the village that had held him when he was miserable, and held him now with far more tenderness, now that he was kind. So that story is by Charles Dickens. Thank you. And I was absolutely delighted when I found it. And you can hear all of the echoes of A Christmas Carol in it. And I feel for poor Gabriel and how his bones ached after his punishment by the Goblin King. Now, there is a lot of Christmas lore. And Santa Claus is part of that, of course. So if there are any younger people listening, adults, I would urge you to whisk them off and get them something sweet for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Santa Claus, of course, came from St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas began as a bishop in Myrna, in what is now in Greece. And he was a good man and a rather ferocious one. And when we think of Santa, we don't think of ferocity. But St. Nick had some power about him when he was just a mere bishop doing the best he could. It happened that there was a famine that came to Myrna. There was no rain for month upon month upon month. Without rain, grain would not grow, nor anything else. And without grain, the animals could not be fed, so the animals all died. The people were so hungry and so miserable. They prayed for rain, and the rain did not come. Nicholas, the bishop, he too prayed for rain, and he desperately wanted to help his people in whatever way he could. There was a woman, a widow, who was very poor and had 3 sons. She gathered together what little money she had earned by doing stitching and what chores she could, and gave it to her 3 boys and asked them to please go find some meat, to bring meat home for a soup that they could all eat, no matter if it was terribly expensive. She yearned for that succulent taste in her mouth. And the boys set off. They didn't return home that night. She told herself that perhaps they'd had to go to the butcher's in the next village, but they didn't return home the next night, nor the night after, and she knew that something terrible had befallen her sons. And so she went to the bishop and asked him to pray. St. Nicholas, not yet a saint, the bishop knelt down and prayed with her, but the boys did not return, and so Nicholas promised that he would go in search of them and see what he could find. Well, the first place that he went was to the butcher shop there in Myrna, and he asked the butcher if he knew what had happened to the boys, and the butcher looked away and then said no, he had never heard of such children, and stepped out of the butcher shop to attend to some other business. Nicholas looked around, and there was a servant. The servant looked up at him, completely terrified and shaking, and Nicholas knew that there was a secret to be revealed. He sat down on the ground next to the servant, and he said, "Kneel down, pray with me." And the two prayed together. "Tell me," said Nicholas, "what has become of the boys?" And with a shaking hand, the servant pointed to a large barrel off to the side of the butcher shop. Nicholas stood by the barrel and wondered what he should do when the butcher came back in. Nicholas reached over and grabbed him before the man could run away, and dragged him over to the barrel and demanded that he open it, which the man did, weeping, because inside there was a salty brine, and in that salty brine floated the limbs and torsos and heads of those boys. The butcher explained that he had had no meat in so long. He was poor. He had no money left. His family was going to starve. And in his desperation, he killed these 3 children. He butchered them, put them in the brine to be pickled, and was going to sell them when the meat was ready. Nicholas was outraged, but he contained his outrage, and he said to the butcher, "Do you think that God will forgive you for what you have done?" The butcher fell to his knees and began to beg for mercy. Nicholas knocked over the barrel, and the boys' bodies rushed out in a rush of brine, and he demanded that the butcher reassemble them, which the man did, his tears falling on their shriveled flesh. And then Nicholas prayed over their bodies, with the butcher praying by his side and the servant as well. And the boys were restored to life. They rose up. They embraced Nicholas, so grateful to be alive. The butcher begged them for forgiveness, and the boys forgave them. The butcher swore he would never do any such thing again, and indeed he lived out his life in great devotion, and Nicholas returned the boys to their mother, and they all celebrated a fine Christmas. I love that story because it's such a different vision of Christmas than what we usually have. And it reminds us that Christmas is a complicated time for some of us, especially if there is a famine. Now, in modern times, when we think about Christmas and the complicated stories around Christmas, many people think of Krampus. Now, the Krampus is a figure from Germanic folklore, from Bavaria, from Germany, from some of Eastern Europe. And now when people think of him, they think of him merely as a Christmas demon who, if a child has been naughty, will beat that child or even might toss him into a basket and take him down to hell. But Krampus is a lot more complicated than that. Originally, St. Nicholas had a number of unusual companions, one of them being Krampus, to punish those who had sinned. Now, when you look at the folklore, you can see a lot of ritual around Krampus. You can find a lot of instances of Krampus dances and celebration and what people in villages might do to pretend they are Krampus. And you might occasionally find a story where someone says, "Oh yeah, my grandpa said that when he was a boy, Krampus came and beat him." But it's hard to find stories. So I created one. The content warning to this is that there is reference to children being treated very badly, kind of like the previous story, which I probably should have given a content warning for. When I was in college, I met Christoph. He was of German descent, and we were drawn to each other because we had a lot of similar overlapping family things going on. My family was from Eastern Europe, from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father was from Germany. And so we liked a lot of the same foods, and we knew a lot of the same stories, and we very quickly became friends. Around Christmas time, Neither of us went home for Christmas in our sophomore year of college. We both stayed in the dorms. He didn't go home because his parents had gone to visit family in Germany, and they would be gone for too long for him to get back in time for school. And I didn't go home because I just didn't feel like it that year. Christmas wasn't a big deal in my family. And so Chris and I spent Christmas together. We had a lovely day. We gave each other gifts. We went for a long walk in that crisp New England winter. And then in the evening, we shared a bottle of wine and told each other stories from our childhood. Chris told me this story. He learned it from his father. He told me that his father said, let me actually rephrase that. This is the story he told me. His father grew up in Germany. And when he came to the United States and met and married Chris's mother, once they had children, they told them about Krampus. But Chris said that his father always said that he was a good boy and Krampus would never come for him. And as he grew older and began to hear more Krampus stories, he wondered why his father didn't tease him about it or use Krampus as a way to make him behave better. And so one day he asked his father. His father was quiet for a very long time. My father told me that when he was a boy, his parents were brutal, that they would beat him for transgressions, real and imagined, and that they told him that he was a terrible child. My grandparents told my father that Krampus would come, and that he would hear Krampus coming, his terrible, heavy hooves echoing on the wooden floor of their apartment. His parents told him that Krampus would break down the door to his room, and that his horns would curve up and scrape the ceiling, and that Krampus would beat him for being a terrible child, and maybe even take him down to hell. My father said that when his parents said that, they told him that they would be glad if he was gone. It was a terrible way to grow up, he said. His parents were no different than most of the parents in their apartment block. They were all poor, they were all hungry, they were all overworked. And his parents, like many others, took out their anger and rage on their child. He was always scared at home. So being scared of Krampus, well, that wasn't much different than anything else. He did his best to be good, to do what his parents told him, but he would be beaten anyway. And as he grew older, he began to become more and more disillusioned with everything. And so one year, when he was 11 years old, his parents had told him that Krampus was going to come and stuff him in a sack and take him down to hell, and then they smacked him around some after dinner and sent him to bed. And as he lay in bed, this 11-year-old boy said, "Fine, I wish Krampus would come and would take me away to hell because it would be better than what's happening here. At least in hell, I would know what to expect." And then, frightened by what he had said, he pulled the blanket over his head and fell asleep. He didn't know what time he woke up. It must have been very late, because the television was off. There was no noise from his parents' bedroom, and he wasn't quite sure what woke him. But he lay there, curled up under his blankets with the blanket over his head, his eyes wide open, and listening. And then he heard it. The heavy footsteps walking down the hall. A great clumping sound, as though something enormous and weighty, with hooves instead of feet, was coming closer to his room. The door was pushed open. He heard the creak of the hinges, and then the footsteps walked up to the side of his bed. He could smell something terrible, a smell like rot, like brimstone. And then the blanket was pulled down, and Chris's father looked up, and there was Krampus. his enormous curving horns nearly scraping the ceiling, his long tongue sticking out of his mouth, his body covered in fur, and clutched in one hand a birch switch and in the other a bag. "Boy," said Krampus, "you have called me, and so I shall give you a gift, but you will pay for it." And then Krampus twitched back the blankets and began to beat the boy with the birch switches. "My father said to me," said Chris, "that it was no worse than most of the other beatings he had received, and so while he certainly cried and begged for it to stop, he was thinking that if this would be hell, it wasn't so bad." And when the beating was done, Krampus stood back up and said, "Remember me." And the boy bravely said, "I am a good boy, but if you're going to take me, take me." And Krampus said, "No, it is not you that I want, but do not forget." And then stuck out that long tongue and licked the boy's face. Then Krampus turned and walked out of his room. Had he turned right, he would have walked to the door and left the flat, but instead he turned left and walked down towards his parents' bedroom. The boy heard the door bang open. He heard his mother scream and his father yell. He heard them weeping and the sound of the switch, and then all was silent. He pulled the blankets over his head and lay there all night long, shaking, waiting for there to be light in his room, and gradually light began to seep through the windows and in between the seams of the heavy wool blanket that he had lying upon him. He pushed the blanket down and listened. The room was bright. Usually, by now, he would hear the television on, the radio on, he would smell his parents' coffee, but all was silent, and he could smell no coffee, no bacon. He couldn't hear his parents arguing in the kitchen. And so the boy pushed the blankets off of him and stepped down onto that cold floor and walked out into the hall. He looked down to see his parents' bedroom door open, and then took a great breath and walked down the hall into their room. There was no one there. The blankets were on the floor. Usually the bed would be made. The room looked as if something terrible had happened. He turned and ran down the hall into the kitchen, but his parents were not there. They were gone. All that remained was the faint aroma of brimstone and one long birch switch lying across his parents' pillow. My father said that he went to the police, and the police could not find out where his parents had gone, and eventually he was taken to an orphanage. He told me that he heard that orphanages were terrible places, but it was far better than where he had been. He grew up, he left Germany, he came to America, he met my mother, and they had me. My father was a profoundly gentle man, said Chris. He never hit me. He never told me that Krampus would take me away. I don't know if the story my father said is true, but I know that my parents loved me. They were gentle, and I am so, so grateful for them. I don't like the idea of children being beaten and punished for just being kids. So it occurred to me that perhaps Krampus would come after someone else. Now, Krampus is by no means the only mysterious and unusual creature associated with Christmas. It's no surprise if you think about it. Christmas is during the dark time of the year, and that is, of course, when monsters are most likely to rise out of our subconscious and frighten us. There is Grýla, who is a great troll in Icelandic folklore. She has many, 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 many sons, known as the Yule lads. And the sons are mischievous. They'll do things like drink all the milk that was milked the night before, or steal the sausage, or lick out the pan that the sausage was cooked in. But Grýla, She is quite terrifying. Grilla will go about and see if anyone has left chores undone and if they're still working on their chores. And if they are, well, Grilla may just consume them. She might eat them up. Grilla also has a cat known as the Yule cat. And the Yule cat is an enormous cat that wanders around on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and makes sure that everyone is wearing new clothes. And if you're not wearing new clothes, well, the Yule cat might just consume you and gobble you up because you're supposed to wear new clothes on Christmas. Krampus is not the only Germanic unusual Christmas creature. There's Frau Perchta. There are lots of things I could say about Frau Perchta. I've learned a lot about the Perchta this year. But Frau Perchta lives high in the mountains, and she checks to make sure that the spinning is done and that no one is still spinning. And if you have not finished your chores, if you're still spinning, or if you left all the threads in a mess, well, Frau Perchta will cut you up the middle with a pair of scissors, scoop out your insides, stuff you with straw, and then leave you perched up by the fireplace like an enormous doll. All of these things, of course, are about social mores and making sure that everyone does what they should on Christmas and other times as well. One I really love is La Befana, who is an Italian figure. She's an Italian witch. And the story goes that she was at home busy doing her chores, sweeping and cooking, and the three wise men came and said that they were going to visit the baby Jesus. Look, he was born under that bright star. And would she like to come with them? La Befana replied that, no, I'm too busy getting everything done. And off they went. But a few days later, La Befana realized her mistake and went chasing after them, but was unable to find the wise men or the baby Jesus. And so she visits children every year at Christmas and leaves them sweets. Now, all of these figures, just like the Krampus, there aren't many very specific stories associated with them. Some years ago, about a decade ago, I was working in New Hampshire. I'd lived there a long time and I'd made lots of friends, and a fairly wealthy family I knew hired me to come and tell Christmas stories on Christmas Day. So I flew in the night before, the way I always do, and I got a hotel room, and then I'd go the next day and share stories with these folks. But that night, I was in a hotel. I needed to go find something to eat. It wasn't a very big town, and the only place that was open was the local bar and grill. So I went there and I sat at the bar, and the barkeep came up to me. He was a big man with a long beard and long flowing white hair. I figured he was one of the guys who went to Bike Week, Motorcycle Week in Laconia, New Hampshire. And he took my order and he said, all right, I'll be right back with you. And off he went to put in my order in the kitchen and to clean some glasses. And I turned around on the stool to look and see who was there. Down at one end of the bar, there were the people who were always at the bar, Christmas or not. And they were busy drinking. I don't know how many drinks in they were, and telling each other the same stories they told each other all the time. There was a family down at one of the tables, no doubt tourists who'd come up for snowmobiling over Christmas. And way down at the other end of the bar, sitting at a table, there were these three old women. They were unusual looking. One of them was this enormous woman with a long nose, and she was sitting there stroking this huge cat that was sitting on her lap. I thought how odd that they let a cat into the bar, but it wasn't really any of my business. There was another woman there with another long nose and a chin that curled up and almost met it. She had a kerchief tied around her hair and tied under her neck, her chin, and she looked so worried. I could hear her talking about how she was running late. There was a third woman. It was the strangest looking woman I've ever seen in my life. She had a long nose that stuck out very far and a long chin that also stuck out, and the two of them almost met as if they were a beak. And she had a pair of scissors that she was playing with in one hand. It made a sound, something like that scraping, clicking sound. I don't know who these women were, I thought, and I thought it was rude to stare, even though they're unusual characters. And the bartender came over and said, all right, here's your dinner. And so he gave me my beer and my sandwich, and I sat there eating, but I couldn't stop watching them out of the corner of my eye. You know what that's like, right? There's someone so unusual, you just have to look at them. And I was trying not to stare. The barkeep came over and he stroked his beard and he said, "You'd be better off if you moved down just a little bit. They don't like it when people look. You can listen, though, if you want." His eyes sparkled. They were so blue. And so after I ate, I took my beer and I walked around the room and I looked at the posters on the wall and the calendar that was posted up for the musicians who were coming to play and local sports events. And then I very casually made my way over to the end of the bar and sat down and sipped my beer. The big woman with the cat was talking about her sons, and it sounded like they got up to some kind of mischief. She was talking about how one of them always was breaking into people's houses and stealing all the sausages in the house. He wouldn't even bring them back to share with her. She was very irritating, but it was funny listening to people complain that the sausages had disappeared again. And then she told them that another one of her sons, well, he thought he was helping when he licked the pans and the plates to try and clean them. And I thought, this woman, she's got some family. And she was petting the cat. And the cat was purring and kneading and staring at me with a rather unsettling intensity, the way cats do. I pulled my jacket a little bit closer around me. I was in my traveling clothes, the stuff that's worn and comfortable. And then the woman who had been complaining about being late in a very loud voice, she was talking about how it was so frustrating getting good treats for the kiddies these days. They were all full of sugar, and all she wanted to do was give some people some dried fruit and a little bit of cake, and now it was so hard to find such good things. She was speaking, moving her hands around with this beautiful Italian accent. And the others were saying to her, "Don't worry. They'll love whatever you give them, and you're going to be late with it anyway, so it's an extra treat." And she said, "I know, but I'm just trying to make up for being late so long ago." The other two women looked at each other and rolled their eyes as if they'd heard this story 1,000 times. The last one kept playing with the scissors, making that whoosh, whoosh sound as the scissors opened and closed. It was a little nerve-wracking, to tell you the truth. I don't think I'd ever seen scissors so big or so sharp. And she was talking about how girls don't do their chores anymore. And how sometimes she still needs to leave people presents. Good straw was hard to come by. Newspaper would do just as well. And then she looked over at me and caught me watching, and slowly opened and closed the scissors. The other two stopped talking and turned to look at me. The one who'd been talking about the sweets gave me a tentative little smile, as if she wanted to make friends. But the other one, the one with the cat, she looked at me and leaned back. She did not smile. I felt a chill run up my spine. The cat jumped down and started walking over towards me. It began to weave around my legs, even as I was sitting on the stool, around the entire stool, and purred, and then put its claws into my legs. And I swear to you, that cat smiled, and I have never seen so many sharp teeth. And then, just onto the other side of me, I heard a voice go, "Ladies, will you be wanting anything?" And the bartender, the guy with the big belly and long beard and white hair, he looked over at them and he crossed his arms. "I won't be having any trouble. This is my place." And the ladies, the women, leaned back, and the cat made its way back over to the woman and jumped up on her lap, and she petted the cat, and she said, "Oh, there'll be no trouble. Young lady," she said, "I hope you get some new clothes for Christmas. Those are a little worn." I finished my beer. I left the bar. I went back to my hotel room, and I double-locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept listening for the sound of cat claws against the wood. So when we don't have the stories that we need, it's up to us to bring those stories to life, good or bad. Now, this time of year is not just Christmas. There are many other holidays this time of year. And in my family, the holiday we observed was Hanukkah, more or less. I grew up in a really secular family. We always had a Christmas tree, even though we were Jewish, and we would light the candles of the menorah. My parents raised me to believe in Santa Claus, and I would get presents on Christmas morning. Later, my parents told me that it was because they didn't want me to feel, excuse me, I had the hiccups. Let me get a sip of water. They didn't want me to feel left out. So they had all the Christmas stuff along with the menorah and the candles and the dreidel and the little Christmas gifts. It was a fun time of year. I didn't really get it. I didn't really get Christmas. I didn't really get Hanukkah. I just knew that it was fun. And there was stuff about miracles around the time of year, and miracles seemed good. It was about latkes and gold coins and a tiny gift for 8 nights and hanging out with friends and celebrating. My grandmother used to come and visit occasionally, though she never came for Christmas or Hanukkah. But when I was 13, that year, Christmas and Hanukkah overlapped the way they do this year, and she came to visit. She had an expression on her face of remarkable disgust when she saw the Christmas tree. And she pulled me aside and said, I'm going to teach you something special about Hanukkah this year. Here's what I want you to do. When we light the candles each night and we eat whatever we have, I want you to save a little bit of your brisket or your latke or whatever it is that we eat, and I'll show you what to do with it. And so that night, we lit the Hanukkah candles, the first candle, the shamash, the candle that does the work, and the one candle. And we had dinner, and my grandmother made latkes, little potato pancakes. She made the best latkes I'd ever had. Mine are nowhere near as good. And we saved a little piece. And after dinner that night, she said, come on, I got something to show you. So she took that piece of latke and put it on a little plate. And we went out and we set it out on the corner of the porch. Grandma, why are you doing that? I asked. No. Don't worry about it. We're going to do it for all 8 nights of Hanukkah, and then I'll tell you what it's about. All right. Grandmothers will do what grandmothers will do. Well, the next morning we went out and there was the plate. The food was gone. Animals must have gotten it or something. Brought it in, washed the plate. That night we lit the second Hanukkah candle and we took a little bit of dinner and we set it out. And the next morning it was gone. And the third night, the fourth, all the way through to the 8th night of Hanukkah. On the 8th night of Hanukkah, we set out the plate. It had a little bit of roasted chicken on it. And my grandmother said, come here, I'm going to tell you a story. We went and sat in her room. And this is the story that she said to me. I learned this story from my grandmother. You know, my grandmother, she was from Czechoslovakia. You call it the Czech Republic now. And she grew up in Prague. And she told me that when she was a girl, well, there were all kinds of problems for the Jews, that people were coming and stealing things from them and accusing them of theft. You know, people have always said terrible things about us, that we steal people's money, that we rip them off, that we do terrible things to babies. We don't do none of that stuff. But my grandma said that when she was a girl, things were getting bad. People were hurting the Jews and people were doing hard things. And so the rabbi in Prague made a golem. A golem, my grandmother said to me, is this figure that you make out of wood, out of mud. And then you take a little slip of paper that has the word for truth and you stick it in its mouth and you say certain prayers and the golem comes to life. And the golem will do whatever you tell it to do, as long as you let it rest on the Sabbath from Friday at sunset till Saturday at sunset. And so the rabbis, they told the golem to keep us safe. And it did. It kept us safe. Whenever someone came and tried to hurt a Jew, the golem was there and would make sure that no one got hurt. And the rabbis told the golem to do work, and they told the golem to do all kinds of things, and they let the golem have the Sabbath off. And everything was okay, for a while at least. The rabbis got news that somebody was going to come, people were going to come, and they were going to try and burn down the synagogue on a Friday night after sunset. And so they went to the golem and they said to it, "We know we shouldn't ask you this, but people are going to come and they're going to try and burn down the synagogue. Would you please stay awake on the Sabbath and help us?" And the golem agreed. And so the golem guarded the synagogue, and people came and they tried to burn it down, and the golem, well, it got them all away. It killed a lot of them. But then after the synagogue was safe again, the golem was in a rage, and it began to try and hurt the rabbi, and it began to break up the synagogue itself. And so the rabbi and many, many, many other strong men had to go to the golem and hold it down. And when they held it down, it took dozens of men to hold it down. It was so strong, the rabbi reached into its mouth and it pulled out that piece of paper. And as soon as the piece of paper was out, the golem stopped moving, and it dissolved back into mud that smelled like the river where they'd gotten the mud in the first place. And the golem was gone. Now, my grandmother, she felt sorry for the golem. It was just trying to do its work. So every night of Hanukkah, she would put out a little food so the golem's spirit could have something to eat and wouldn't be lonely. And she taught her daughters to do that and taught me to do that. Now I'm your grandmother and I'm teaching you to do that. So that's why we're doing it. Well, I listened to the story and I thanked my grandmother. It was a good story and it seemed a little weird to me. I mean, I was 13 years old. And then Grandma fell asleep. That's what she did. She talked and fell asleep. And I fell asleep. And in the morning, we went out to gather that little dish that we'd put out that bit of chicken on. And sitting on the dish was a stone, round and smooth. I picked it up and held it to me. I touched it against my cheek. And then I could smell it. It smelled like river mud. And Grandma looked at me and she said, well, she died the next year, but at Hanukkah, every night I put out a little bit of something. And on the morning after the 8th night, there on the plate was a stone. And the year after, and the year after, and on and on and on. Well, it's been a long time now. And I have this bowl of stones that I keep on my desk. Some of them are stones I bought because I thought they were beautiful. But some are round and smooth and smell a little bit like river mud. When Hanukkah comes again this year, I will put out a little bit on a plate each night to say thank you. And so the golem remembers itself, its spirit out there in the world. I hope I never need to call upon the golem. But if I do, the golem will know that I remembered it, and maybe it will remember me. I have one more story for you tonight, but before I do, I'm going to drop in the chat some information about how you can keep in touch with me. So this has, and I'll send all of this to you in email as well, but in case you want it, come on, oops, cancel, return. Oh, it's too long. Hang on a minute. I have to do it in 2 bits. So this email has, wow, I didn't know there was a limit on chats. This chat has my website, some information about some upcoming work that I'm doing, some information about how you can support me on Patreon, all those kinds of things. So if you want to reach me, you can reach me through any of those ways. When I send out the follow-up information that will include the video, I'll include this, and I will also include a brief bibliography that includes a few of the resources that I used to inspire me for some of the stories that you've heard tonight. The last story that I want to share with you brings us back to ghosts. This time of year is about family and celebration and remembering those whom we miss. She loved Christmas. It was absolutely her favorite holiday from the time she was a little girl until she grew up and had a family of her own. She loved how the family came together and the foods that they made. They always made the same thing. They always had a ham for Christmas. They told the same stories. They played the same games. On Christmas Eve, everyone would open up one gift each, and then they would play Scrabble. Her family played killer Scrabble. It was always a really competitive game, and somehow always, at least one of the games that they played, the little kid would always win. After Scrabble was done, after all the kids had gone to sleep, the adults would have a little bit of scotch. They would wash the dishes, they would look at the tree, and they would anticipate the morning. They'd go to sleep because they knew that the kids would wake them up so early. And one of her favorite things was when her kids were little and they would come running in before the sun had even risen and jump onto the bed and wake her up with a start. She loved it. She loved how their joy was incandescent on Christmas morning. And then they would all gather and they would open gifts. The kids, the adults, all of them reveling in the gifts that they received. Everyone always got something for Santa, whether or not they were young enough to know that Santa still existed or old enough to be so foolish as to think that Santa was just a game. They'd make French toast for breakfast. And this Christmas was like every Christmas. She was with her family. They had ham for Christmas Eve dinner. They played Scrabble. One of the kids won. They had their little bit of scotch that night. The kids came rushing in and woke everyone up. When they all opened their gifts, she just sat there and looked at their radiant faces. They played games all day long. She watched as the kids ran around and played with their new toys. She was in the kitchen as dinner was being cooked. She was with everybody, and her heart was so full. After dinner, the clink of the dishes as they were being washed and cleaned up. She thought about all of the Christmases she'd had and how they all were just like this, even though each one was different. She helped tuck the kids in, kissed them on the forehead, and watched as they immediately fell into that sleep, their faces soft, their mouths slack, and their hands curled up beside them. It was the sweetest thing. When she finally made her way downstairs, her daughter was sitting on the couch. Even the other adults had gone to sleep. Everyone was tired. But there her daughter was with a little bit of scotch. It smelled like peat and like thyme. And she sat down next to her daughter. And then, as she leaned against her daughter's side, her daughter pulled the blanket closer around her and said, "Mom, I miss you so much. Christmas isn't Christmas without you. I'm trying to do it, but without you, it's just not the same." She put her arm around her daughter, and her daughter shivered and pulled the blanket closer. She wiped the tears from her daughter's face and watched as they turned to just a tiny bit of frost. "Mom, I know that all of this is just a story that we tell ourselves, that our beloved dead come back at midnight on Christmas and we can talk to them. I know it's not real, but I wish you could hear me. I wish you knew how much I miss you and how much I love you. Merry Christmas, Mom. I hope that you're here." And then she wiped her own tears away, and the daughter stood up and made her way to her warm bed. She sat there for a bit longer, there in the living room, tracing against the window and watching the frost that her fingers left. She stood by her daughter's bedside and watched as her daughter fell asleep, her mouth open, her hands by her side. And then she went away until next Christmas. Thank you all so much.